Today, I am so excited to be joined none other by Ryan Pryor. A lot of people in our MECFS community already know who Ryan is, but I'm especially excited to be introducing Ryan today because he is the author of an upcoming book called The Long Haul. And this is a book that really delves into long COVID and solving the puzzle of this pandemic and how it relates to MECFS. So without further ado, I'd love to talk a little bit more about this, Ryan. And I'm wondering if you could first explain just starting about yourself and your MECFS journey prior to long COVID.
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me. And yeah, happy to, I've been part of the MECFS community for about 15 years now. I came down with a post-infectious illness October 22nd, 2006, and then had to drop out of high school. I was a junior in high school at the time, and where I was on a hospital homebound program. So I had teachers had to come to my house to help teach me throughout my junior year of high school, and was ultimately, we went to about 16 different doctors, and was diagnosed with MECFS in 2007. So throughout my, ultimately graduated from high school and got into college, and throughout my college experience, I was frequently having lots of crashes, and had disability accommodations, and was taking 20 pills a day and giving myself a shot once a week and getting an IV infusion every month. Yeah, things worked out. I eventually graduated and became a journalist. And so in my journalism career, ME and chronic illness and patient-led research and cutting edge science innovation have all been themes that I've tried to highlight. And I think there's how ME bubbles up into a larger ecosystem of biomedical research and changing the future of healthcare have been themes in my career.
Absolutely, that's amazing. You've done so much important advocacy work over the years. So I'm wondering then if you could, I know things got a little complicated in 2020 for you. So if you could walk me through what that was like. So you actually experienced COVID and then long COVID yourself. So I'm wondering if you could just tell us more about that experience, what happened and what that was like to navigate that.
Yeah, so I remember leaving being in the midst of I was covering COVID for CNN in a variety of roles as a breaking news writer, and then as a features writer, and on the health team for CNN. And especially very early in the pandemic, knowing I was immune compromised, knowing my body did not fight off viruses, and I knew a lot of people's bodies didn't fight off viruses very well. And I didn't necessarily think I was going to die from COVID if I got it, but I did think it was going to hit me a lot harder than it would hit everybody else. And I knew that based on like the underlying biology of how about 10% of people react to viruses and have these post-infectious or post-viral conditions, I knew I was in a danger zone. And so I did my best throughout 2020, and I was working, fortunately for CNN, I was able to work from home throughout that period, and all of us were working from home.
Right.
My last day at the office was the night that President Trump gave a speech from the Oval Office about about the response, and I left that night, and that was like did not come back into the office for I think 16 months. But so I ended up getting COVID, or getting a positive test Christmas Eve of 2020.
Oh my gosh.
And so for that first week,
the holidays.
yeah, so I got COVID for Christmas, and then I got some long COVID symptoms for the following 2 months, and I was on short-term disability from my work, and even though we were working from home, I was had been hit pretty hard. A lot of the same fatigue and brain fog and post-exertional crash type symptoms that kind of are part of the post-viral picture that we know about from a patient experience, and as indicated in the research. So I think I was not able to go back to work full-time, or at least telecommute in until March. I think it was early March of 2021, and
Wow.
then but I was able to use, some of that. It was barely holding it together, especially in those early months, trying to come back into work. But and I was that I don't want to say deathly afraid, but like morbidly afraid that this was going to be the virus that took me down. Again, I had recovered to a degree, about 90% from MECFS, from where I had been when I was in high school. But I also knew that I was pretty vulnerable to future crashes, and knowing how powerful COVID is as a virus.
Sure.
Yeah, it was very uncertain. So I signed the book deal probably in February of 2021, and I did not know if I'd be able to write the book because I was so sick.
Yeah, I was just
That
gonna
was
ask,
an act of faith.
because that must have been a really difficult. So you decided, so when was that moment for you when you decided, while you're going through this is something that I need to write about? This is a book.
Yeah, I spoke at the National Association of Science Writers in a panel about how to cover contested illnesses in October of 2020, and I admitted that, yeah, I spoke with co-moderated a panel with Pam Wintraub, who wrote a notable book about Lyme disease called Cure
Right.
Unknown.
Right.
And I said, oh, I'm contemplating writing a book about long COVID, but I figured you're going to do that. And she said, no, I don't want to write disease book after disease book. And I now know, I also agree with her. Having written the disease book, I don't think I'll write another disease book, at least not anytime soon. So Pam said, be my guest. I'll let you chat with my agent, and we'll get you set up. And
Wow.
so we put together the proposal in about 6 weeks. So it was about I don't remember even now, but like a 60 or 70 page proposal to with the marketing, a couple chapters, and a marketing outline. And so we were shopping that around and just after Thanksgiving, and had an offer in early December. So I got COVID a few weeks later, and I remember telling my agent, "Oh, this is going to be great for the book," that I got sick, and
Yeah.
she's like, "No, it's not." And yeah, and it was. I mean, it's both good and bad. So the intention was never to write about my personal story, but there's a chapter in there that details my own experiences.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so this book focuses on the individual experiences and stories of other people that are navigating long COVID or are going through this then.
Yeah. So I'm basically a science writer by trade, and so had written a lot of pieces about COVID, about science, but really about COVID, and so wearing my CNN reporter hat, yeah, the intention was to interview patients and interview scientists and interview doctors, and talk about the full international landscape about how this was going to affect health systems for the coming decades. How they're I didn't quite have the terminology about what we call now a post or a mass disabling event, which is
Right.
millions of people. I understood intuitively, especially like in spring of 2020, as this was going on, that this was going to affect a significant number of patients in ways that the MECFS community understood,
Right.
but that
Right.
the rest of the world didn't. And we didn't have the word long COVID or long hauler, or like I said, mass disabling event. But I think a lot of us, Linda Tannenbaum at OMF included, felt this was something very bad was on the horizon. So my mission as a journalist was to cover the human and scientific and medical and political and societal and economic costs of it, but really to tell it through a lens of a handful of characters that I thought were like the human heartbeat at the center of this pandemic, which is really like the most world changing event of the 21st century. So I felt like my whole life had set me up to write this. So the patient and my own patient experience, which is included in the second half of the book, a little bit was an added bonus. The virus gave me my own run for my money.
Right, because it is so interesting, because I think you're right that people with MECFS, we kind of had this unique foresight into what might happen, having lived through these personal disabling events. And so many of us we had this viral trigger, this viral onset. And so I even remember that in, I think it was, April, hearing about all of these people getting sick. It was April 2020, a few weeks later, and realizing, wow, this is actually, I wonder what the recovery process is going to be like. And I actually don't remember the first time I heard the word long COVID, but I do know it was interesting because I remember reading that this was a term that was really defined on social media through patients themselves that were describing this. And I think that is so interesting that it was just a collective of people coming together and saying, what is going on? Like, we're done with this acute phase, but yet we're still living in this limbo and nobody seems to have answers. And people on the MECFS side of that were saying, oh, this sounds a little familiar, doesn't it? So
yeah, I think it was traumatizing for anybody who's been through this horrific event of MECFS, who's
yes,
felt like they've been erased from society, that their sense of selfhood has been erased, that they're being gaslit,
right.
and that they have a disease that the whole of Western science appears to have no real footing for understanding,
Exactly, right.
or at least. And
Started.
I do believe that molecular biology is going to solve MECFS, but at least when your initial entry point is that every doctor you speak to isn't going to understand it. So it's really deeply distressing for every ME patient, I think, to know that what they've gone through is going to be a psychological journey for each other post-viral patient, that all of these other people are going to have their own life cave in, and they're going to have to completely reorient their understanding of what it means to be a human.
Right.
And so that is that was what I was personally going through as I was my own lens for viewing the pandemic. And I think so. Disabled people, or chronically ill, or people with ME, have a form of wisdom that needs to be projected far and wide, and need to have a seat at the table as decisions are being made.
Absolutely.
And one of the a core thing that stuck out to me, especially as a CNN reporter covering it in February 2020, was that a number of White House officials would make comments that would say something to the effect of, for the vast majority of us, we have nothing to be afraid of. A few people who are immune compromised may die. And I remember someone tweeting and saying, just as an FYI to the powers that be, those of us who are immune compromised, like we can hear you when you say those words.
Right.
So the immune compromised people or disabled people need to be part of the we, and I'll preach that everywhere I can.
Yes, I think that's so important. I think that's still a common theme that I see even 2 years post-pandemic. As we get back to normal, there's still this, oh, well, COVID is out here, but we're resuming a sense of normalcy, except for those who are immunocompromised. And it's almost this picture of us being, or people that are chronically ill being the other, as separate from society, which creates even more divide and an invalidation. And it is at the very heart of it, emotionally traumatizing to go through that, to feel left out and totally just unprotected by our society and our governments and our healthcare system. So I think you're picking up on that in the book is just hugely, like, it's just, there was a lot of, I do remember seeing that, especially in the beginning, that this virus will not kill you. But then unless you have this if you're immunocompromised. And then the second thing that I remember thinking is, okay, well, maybe it won't kill you, but there is this whole, death isn't the only thing that could happen after someone gets a virus or infection. There's this whole other world where some people just don't recover. And that wasn't really being communicated. It was like, oh, you probably won't die. Okay. Well, it's leaving this whole conversation out that what happens to everyone else that just, they don't die, but they also don't recover fully.
Yeah, and I'll just one way that I would advocate about how we might think about future pandemics. And I do want to make sure that this book is used as an example for how to cover pandemics in the future. Is that we as a society, we frequently talk about this idea of a case fatality rate. And so people would make an argument that, less than 1% of the people are going to die. We don't need to do lockdowns and this and this and this. But a very easy way to frame this is, not just case fatality rate, but what would be a case disability rate? And that's going to be about 10, depending on what set of numbers you use. And I'll use easy numbers and say that could be about 10 times higher of disabling effects versus the fatal effect. And it makes sense that anything that's the philosopher Nietzsche says, whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. That's all. It's also true that whatever doesn't kill you could simply disable you,
Right.
and that is important. That with any other bad thing that occurred, like if you go into war, if you don't get killed, you might get maimed. You might come out with PTSD or a long-term injury. And we know that with soldiers coming back from Iraq that there's fewer deaths than Vietnam, but there's a lot more disability. And so the same thing is true with COVID, that there might not be as many deaths as occurred in certain other viral diseases, but as a society, we need to frame what does it look like to take care of people who are disabled from these mass tragedies.
Absolutely. It's so important. Just that the impact is enormous. We don't know, the economic impact is one number that I see being thrown around a lot or being talked about a lot. We just reached, I believe it was over 1 million people just in the United States that are now out of work due to this, due to this mass disabling event. And that's just one small aspect of it. And I do think it's just that it's almost the second pandemic that rages on as COVID exists. It's just this, it continues to create this long-term disablement. And I'm curious just about while you were writing, what did you find to be some of the biggest challenges in getting this story out and communicating all of these points while you were writing?
I think it was fairly easy or intuitive for me to, most of my life as a writer was, reaching out to, prior to the book and prior to the pandemic was, reaching out to experts, reaching out to sources, getting them on the phone, getting the reporting, getting the piece done, edited, fact-checked, and published ahead of your deadline. And that was equally true during the pandemic, if not more. Any scientist I reached out to who was actively working on COVID felt a sense of mission in a way that no other scientists that I had encountered had felt, naturally so. Like we were living in an event that by some respects, may have threatened the future of humanity. So getting the pandemic figured out was the most motivational thing that most scientists are going to go through in their lifetime. So I loved getting to speak to scientists throughout my CNN, reporting for my day job, and then when I pivoted over into doing the book full time, met some incredible people. And one of the clinicians I'll highlight, who I think deserves a lot of credit, is Dr. David Petrino, who runs the Mount Sinai post-COVID clinic. He has an incredible background as a PhD in computational science. He's also a physical therapist.
Wow.
He understands the patient-centered side of doing high-tech research. I'll say that in a little snapshot there, but there's a lot more to it. And he's become really one of the, he's been probably, in my opinion, was probably the most interesting person to interview. And I think he has a unique insight into how this is all unfolding and the ways that a lot of doctors are getting long COVID wrong, and partly because they're not actually seeing the patient. And this really comes down to a very basic concept, which the most well-known journalist who covered MECFS in the 80s and 90s, Hillary Johnson, who wrote a book, Osler's Web. She talks about Sir William Osler, who was the dean of medical education, so to speak. He was the most famous medical scholar of the 19th century, and he argues that listen to the patient, and he or she will tell you what the disease is. And what I see Dr. Petrino doing in the Mount Sinai Clinic in the 21st century during this global health crisis is very similar. I mean, he's got all the degrees to back it up, but it's a patient-centered approach. And that's where most of medicine, I think, is going to improve when we do a patient-centered approach. And the coming era, which molecular biology is helping to inaugurate, is one in which precision medicine and personalized medicine will become the norm for a much larger number of people. And so taking that personalized approach to each individual long COVID patient is one of the first things that I would say that should be blatantly obvious.
Right.
And that's been, if you're asking the question of what's been the hardest thing to communicate, I think it's the most the most obvious thing has been one of the harder things to get across.
So I mean, because that brings me to another like great question, I think, to follow up on what you're saying, is what do reporters get right about long COVID when they report it, and what do they get wrong? And I think you answered that a little bit by saying like this lack of patient-centered maybe approach to looking at this problem and looking at the patients. What do you think on the other end of that is the thing when looking back at all of the reports and how we communicate about long COVID, what would you say we're getting right when we communicate this story in the media?
Yeah, the body politic, which is one of the predominant support groups for online support groups for people with long COVID, talks about being patient-centered and historically informed. And so the historically informed part is important. Not part of that is being informed by how previous viral pandemics have things like this happened with the 1918 flu. We had mass disabling events following polio virus, mass disabling event following HIV, which is AIDS. It makes sense that there's going to be this type of illness following a virus. That's part of it. There's also a social justice component where you need to frame these. I think the disability rights movement needs to be framed in the similar light to how women's rights or civil rights or gay rights is framed. That this is a huge group of people whose human rights matter, and which are not necessarily being framed or not being elevated. And there's a big, pretty major mistake that I think is obvious that I hate to see reporters do this, and some of them still do. Talking about this as like these puzzling symptoms, this befuddling, confusing, strange, new illness, especially in the headlines. It needs, you need to, I'm doing a piece for a magazine at the moment about what it literally is what reporters get wrong when they write about disability. And I'll say what reporters get wrong when they write about long COVID. Is calling this a new disease. It's not. Calling it confusing. It's not as confusing once you actually talk to experts. And then one of the things is talking to an overemphasis on talking to clinicians, particularly clinicians who don't see long COVID patients.
Right.
And that's, you'll get the wrong information if you do that. And a lot of reporters find that when you call up patients, you get I think, in my opinion, the quality of information was sometimes 10 times better if I talked to a patient versus talking to certain clinicians.
Right.
The human desperation fuels innovation, which is, necessity is the mother of invention. People who need the system to work better are going to be actively figuring out ways to make it work better. And so that's where the patient-led research collaborative is another group that I think is of historic importance for centering the patient experience.
Right.
And my role as a reporter was to is and has been and always will be to reach out to the best people to figure out what's going on. And it was clear if I thought, I was just trying to talk to who was the smartest. And in my opinion, it was Hannah Davis, who's the head of the patient-led research collaborative. She was putting out the best information. And you can, and she's collating all the science coming out from all over the world and judging it and elevating what's good and what's new. And there's people that I've spoken to who do like these really interesting social media, healthcare and social media analytics. You can draw
Right.
these webs off the long COVID hashtag of who's using long COVID hashtag, who's most influential.
Right.
I had a guy draw this for me who worked for a place called Simpler Analytics.
Oh,
And
yeah, I know. Yeah, I've heard of
Hannah
it.
Davis is the center of the web. And that was
Right.
my intuition following the story. And yeah, so that was one of a key character in the book. And that, which is to say that certain people from the CDC, well, I mean, there's great people at NIH and great people at CDC, but there wasn't anybody who was quite at that level. And there's a interesting quote in the book where someone refers to Hannah Davis as the Larry Kramer of long COVID.
Oh,
And
wow.
and it was just funny as I mentioned that to Hannah, and she's like, I don't know who's Larry Kramer, and so we explained this in the book that he was the kind of the predominant AIDS activist as part of
Right.
founder of ACT UP.
I think it's just social media, I will say, plays a very unique role in COVID and how we've come to understand this experience, especially the patient experience, because unlike, say, the 1918, the Spanish influenza, and even in the 80s when we had HIV, we never really had this two-way communication between journalists and between patients. And now we're able to use platforms like Twitter to really connect and to have this dialogue and say, hey, like, for example, I think one of the interesting things is how the long COVID community immediately connected to the MECFS community. So people were talking about their experiences and they were finding each other through, for example, these hashtags. And, and people with MECFS, say 10 years down the road of them having an illness, were able to connect with people that now were newly diagnosed with long COVID. We're trying to figure out what was going on with them, and they were able to point them in the right direction. But had we not had this kind of digital town square, so to speak, of these people connecting and sharing their patient experience very vocally, I think that would have gotten buried. And I think that's also why, maybe in my opinion, I think that's helped us to usher our way into this more patient-centered era of medicine, this personalized approach. Because I think you're right. It's just so important to, for example, like when we talk about medical education, we could talk about it in forms of statistics and how many people get sick, but those are numbers. So that's why I'm personally a big proponent of case studies and having patients connect with doctors personally. So I think you just make such a great point about this connection.
Yeah, it's so much easier to tell it from just through the lens of like, it's a narrative arc, person living a life, got a virus, here's what happens, ... And it gets really, if you dress that up in epidemiological reports, you lose the human center of it, which is you lose the narrative thread, and it doesn't really hold together as a story. And humans process the world through stories, and so I was really, in writing the book was keyed in on telling us through like, basic people. And I don't think I was trying to do anything profound from like a computational like science standpoint. I was just like trying to keep track of what happened, and I used characters are a way to do that. And couple key characters. One is Alison Sobrana, who was a MECFS patient going back to about 2014. She joined the body politic group. She did not have COVID, but she knew that the people in body politic were probably going to be experiencing MECFS or something along those lines, and she jumped in there, demanded to be brought in, and her viewpoint, which is the MECFS viewpoint, came to permeate that group, and she played a huge role in helping make sure that body politic was historically informed, basically, and then body politic in other groups were very influential in the media. And then another key character, Elisa Perigo, who's an Italian archaeologist, she coined the term long COVID.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, so she is sort of, she uses this hashtag in English, which is, the language is important, because she makes a kind of a somewhat stray comment, I think, in like spring of 2020, saying this, this so-called long COVID is kind of looks like this is happening, and that's where it sprouts from there. You've got some different hashtags and some different languages. In Spanish, it's COVID. It was hashtag COVID persistente, and then in French it was après jour 20, which is like after day 20. So having symptoms after day 20, and those were catchy, but long COVID was the catchiest, and I think it's helpful that it was in English, and so Elisa communicates in Italian and Spanish, or in English, but the getting it to resonate across the English-speaking world was particularly meaningful, I think, in this capacity. And then Elisa, I will strongly credit her for staying on it for a very long time and never stopped beating the drum that this was the patient-created term. It's also from a marketing standpoint, I think it's the catchiest. It's the most, I don't know, I won't quite say it's poetic, but it's easy to say. The NIH created the term, or the government created the term, was just post-acute sequelae of COVID. There is some virtue to that for being like scientifically like descriptive, but it buries the lead. Also, long COVID is a word that regular human beings understand.
Right. That's what I like. I mean, I think that's what's so unique about calling it that. It's just, it's so, it's very relatable immediately. You're able to understand, long COVID. So it's almost just like, as your book title, The Long Haul. That's immediately the imagery that you get in your head, I think, is that you're in it for the long haul. And then, of course, I remember that back in, even in early 2020, when it was just the long haulers, that's what was really emerging. And I remember seeing that. And I know that people with MECFS immediately said, okay, we've been long haulers for years and years. And I just think you're right, that this is, there's something extremely unique about this being a patient coined term, and it's permeated into the science community as well, because you have doctors that now say long COVID, and they sometimes that's, although there is PACS, the post-acute COVID sequelae, like we have that as well, but now you're seeing even the medical community was adopting long COVID. And I think that language was important because in a way it was almost like the medical community joining hands with the patient community there and accepting the term for it and understanding it. And that's something that we previously perhaps haven't even gotten that far with other post-viral illnesses.
Yeah, it's especially important just because the number of healthcare workers who got COVID and then who therefore get long COVID, there isn't this sort of weird separation between patient and doctor, because a lot of the doctors are patients, a lot of the patients are doctors. There isn't the identity is both identities exist inside the same person, and so there's a lot of there's an important role of being a patient researcher or a researcher patient, and if someone's only a patient or only a researcher, you don't get that same amplification of effort. So that's been interesting. And the term, we've had a name game in this community for a long time about chronic fatigue syndrome versus myalgic encephalomyelitis, or MECFS. No one seems to be able to win there's no good answer on that
Right.
question. And so yeah, long COVID and long hauler are great answers to the question. And I think it's been, I'll reference a couple different MECFS advocates in the book and call them an H1N1 long hauler or an Epstein-Barr long hauler. And I think that there's real value in that language. I find it very folksy and poetic. Some people say it sounds like a country song. I don't think it's a bad thing that it sounds like a country
Yeah.
song. I think that's
Yeah, I agree.
maybe part of the appeal. And the word long hauler comes from um, one of the early advocates who was went to go get tested for COVID, and Amy, make sure I get her name right, Amy Watson. She decides to put on her like lucky like long haul trucker hat to go get tested.
Oh, wow.
Interestingly, the long haul trucking community feels that they have a place here in history.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah,
I didn't know that backstory.
there's an interesting article written on a place called overdrive.com, which was a site for long haul trucking news.
Oh,
And they were pretty happy about the fact that their word is really resonating around the world.
I mean, it really does, because it's a journey, and I think people just go through this whole, I mean, it's not just a literal journey of going from doctor to doctor, but also just an intensely emotional journey, where your identity is just totally challenged and reshaped by chronic illness. I don't know if that's something that you were able to experience while going through long COVID, or if maybe if that was something, a theme in your book, is exploring identity and illness.
Yeah, thematically, yeah, it's essentially the most important, question that we strive to answer for ourselves as human beings, as who we are. I know in my own life, I used to say that like the entirety of my existence pivoted on a certain day, October 22nd, 2006, when I got this illness, and I came home from school and slept for 16 hours. And I think that that's more or less the case with long haulers I interviewed, and most people were pretty aware. March 17th, 2020, I got a light cough, and and then that was, I've never been the same since. And I've heard that narrative for years with MECFS patients, so it was pretty clear, just knowing what to look for, and that the same, a doctor might call that a patient history. I call that a story. That's you look for those narrative threads, and there's plot points. The pivotal plot point is the moment of viral onset, and so that the moment of viral onset, as an English major, I see that as the insinuating moment of the plot. That's where the entire story pivots. That's where it gets interesting, and that will be like the first page of a novel. And well, the first page of my book is technically about referencing that Oval Office speech that Trump was giving.
That really just put it into motion. Yeah, that was that was your moment when you realized, would you say, a pivotal moment?
And so even though all of my life had led up to this moment of knowing that this might happen, then that the awareness, so seeing my own narrative voice as a character in the book, I have the moment of realization. During the Anderson Cooper 360 show, watching President Trump speak, and then getting a sense that this is the world is turning, and then my particular frame in the world is also turning, and my mission in life, therefore, is going to be to tell a story. I had produced a documentary film about this disease before this, but ultimately I actually wanted to be an author more so than a film director. So this was my opportunity to become an author, and I could see how things were going to start coming into focus.
That's amazing. And I mean, what was the most surprising thing that you learned or discovered through writing this?
I think part of it's like I learned a lot of things about the publishing industry and about journalism and about the political world, and I think I learned something about humanity, that I think that the world is a bit more divisive than I realized, and I think that that manifests in a couple ways in which you would think that a pandemic like this would bring us together rather than separate us. So that was one major sad but true learning point for me. And then another thing is that I believe that the best researchers were going to immediately get funding to study long COVID, and that it would be very clear that there was a steady progression from getting the virus to getting long-term symptoms to getting what might be a post-infectious disabling disease. And the fact that there's been a huge amount of progress, so I don't want to discount that. And there's been a lot of people who've changed, a lot of hearts and minds have gotten changed. But I've been surprised that some people, some experts have dug in their heels and not been able to see long COVID for what it really is. And I'll borrow a phrase that my colleague Kim Nackstead, who was the former disability advisor for the Biden White House, she frequently talks about the need to see this through the lens of disability, which is different from seeing it through the lens of infectious disease or through the lens, the lens of psychology for that matter. Seeing it through the lens of disability means that this isn't an illness that goes away. This is an illness that's permanent. That's the basic idea of what disability means. And when you see it through that lens, people have a certain set of human rights that are enshrined by law through the Americans with Disabilities Act and other human rights structures in the other countries. And but you're operating under an understanding that the status quo has changed, and unless you act urgently and quickly, the status quo will stay, that you'll be sick. So I think that's helpful. And so patients, I think it dawns on patients earlier than it will probably dawn on a lot of doctors, but that's useful for clinicians who are working with a patient, is that they need to see this as something that's more often the inertia of the illness is that it is going to stay rather than go.
And exactly. And I think that's one of the amazing things that your book could help bring to light. And hopefully, it just has not only just for patients to resonate around the world and to understand the journey better, but also to expose this narrative for the general public, for doctors, for healthcare providers to understand things with that disability lens and that patient-centric narrative. Ryan's book will be available, is now available for pre-ordering on Amazon. So we'll share the link. So Ryan's book comes out on November 15th. And we are so excited to be able to share this interview and more about your story, Ryan. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.